Hi, welcome to Chad Silversmithing. First, thanks for coming here. I appreciate your visiting. If you make sure to hit the like button before you leave, I'd appreciate it. And I'd love to have you subscribe. I want to give a shout out to my patrons over at Patreon, and I have a new one. Her name is Lisa M. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate your support, and I really, it's people like you who make this possible for me to do. So thanks for that. If you're interested in Patreon, I'll put a few pictures of some recent projects that are exclusively to Patreon up there, so you might check it out. There's multiple tiers you can join at, and with gradually more and more privileges. So check it out. If you'd like to support me in a less monthly scale, I have a link up there to buy me a coffee, or in the project description as well. And links to both of those are in the project description as well. So. Check it out, think about it, come back and watch more videos. But either way, let's get started on today's project. I'm going to make a bezel set cabochon in a triple band ring, and the band is sort of offset. It's something that I kind of came up with years ago when I was just fiddling around looking for new designs, and I don't think I've ever made a second one. So my wife kept the first one, and so I still have it on hand, and I'll show you that in a minute. But let's get started on the project. Let me show you the stone I picked out first. We got a little black onyx cab. These are always reasonably priced, but they always look nice. Black goes with everything, right? So use that. The materials that I'm going to use are, for the bezel, I'll use 3/16 inch fine silver bezel strip. It's 28 gauge, I believe. For part of the band, I'll use this 8 gauge half round wire. For part of the other part of the band, I'm going to use some 14 gauge round wire. For the bottom of the bezel, I'll be using some 26 gauge sterling sheet. And I think that's pretty much everything. If I think of what else we might need as we go along, I'll let you know. As always, I use hard silver solder in sheet form. And I use My-T-Flux from Rio Grande. It's same basically as batter and self-pickling flux. They both work about the same. And let's see. Let me show you the design here. I drew it out so you can see it in. You'll notice when you look at it from this angle that these ones go completely in a circle underneath the bezel, whereas the 14 gauge wires that are soldered together meet up on the sides of the bezel. So I hope I have that in frame where you can see it. Yeah, so that's a little bit challenging to do, some that are under and some that are on top. So. And looking at it from which I just noticed, it looks like I filed a flat spot on top of these a little bit in order to make it sit down a little lower. So, I'll have to try and figure out how I did this in the past. It'll be kind of fun. So, but this is basically the drawings of it. So I did some side views and a top view. All right. So I think first let's make a bezel for the stone. It's always a good starting place. File this flat. Make sure he's pretty snug around there. If you ever have questions about what I'm doing, and if I haven't explained it in the video, feel free to leave questions in the comments. It helps if you very specifically reference what you're talking about, though, because sometimes people put comments in there and they're like, why did you file that? And I'll be like, especially if it's a video I made, 3 or 4 months ago, I won't know probably what you're referring to, and I don't always have time to go review everyone to figure it out. So I'm also getting to the point where it's not telling me on YouTube when I have new comments all the time. So if I miss your comment, I apologize. I'll try to answer them all. Okay, so let's cut a little solder here. Get out. There we go. Oopsie. Whenever you're making bezels, you never want to stick around too long after that solder flows, because it has a tendency to soften up and pull apart, and then you have a gap in the middle usually, or on the sides I should say. Nobody wants a gap in their bezel. Okay, let's shape him a little bit. I just use the very tips of my needle nose usually to shape these. I make it square or rectangular when I solder it, just because it's easier to get a nice flat surface to put the solder on, because I like to solder it on the outside of the bezel, and also just generally get better solder joints when I've got two things going straight towards each other rather than kind of a curve. So there's no real right way to do it, it's just how you like to do it. Let's cut a little piece of this off the corner. I always leave about 1/8 of an inch on each side just to give us a little spot to point the heat at when we're soldering this on. It's always harder to get something hot enough when it's laying flat on the sheet or flat on the soldering pad. Some people use those tripods so they can get underneath them, and that might be a useful tool to have around. You might have seen those before. I had one of those for a long time, but I so rarely used it that I think I gave it to somebody, one of my old students. A lot of people ask about these little shears. These are just a brand called Fiskars that are just craft shears. You can find them at hobby stores or Target probably. And they're good for thin sheet. You're pushing the limits when you start getting upwards of 18 gauge or so. But I find that those cut thin silver pretty well, actually. So. Nice and crusty. Just going to throw, I don't know, 3 or 4 of these in there. I'd rather have too much than not enough. It's going to be concealed by the stone, any kind of mess you leave anyway, so. I'm just tucking it up against the side so it's touching the bottom and the sides. When you're heating this, in order to get them both up to the soldering temperature, which since I'm using hard silver solder is 1450-ish, getting that sheet on the bottom hot is harder than getting the bezel hot, because the bezel is exposed on top of this and sort of protects the sheet. So you got to kind of, that's what the extra sheet on the edge is for, so you've got somewhere to point the heat at. Prevent you from melting the bezel before you get the sheet hot enough. I'm kind of really not pointing it right at the bezel, but when it starts to flow, then I'll kind of point it at the crack right between the two. See the shiny seam forming around there. Usually take it around once or twice to make sure it pulls it all the way around. Solder tends to follow the heat where you go. Let's cool that off. Next I'll just trim this off. It's just going to be a plain bezel with no sheet sticking out from it or anything. So basically I just filed off any kind of lip that remained there. Set that off aside for a minute. Now let's decide what size of ring we're going to make. Since this is going to be the smallest hoop here, these other ones kind of stick up above your finger. We'll use that as a size gauge. So let's make it like a size 8. How about that? It's a good kind of in-between size. So let me cut a little piece of paper. When I'm measuring for a size, if I wrap a piece of paper around the mandrel like this, and I want to be able to get it pretty close to the size I'm shooting for, I'm going to add about an extra 1/8 of an inch on there. So I'm going to go about right there. And what that does, that compensates, because we're measuring with something that's very thin. The thickness of the material we're going to use plays a role on making the inside diameter of the ring itself smaller, and so that'll compensate for that a little bit, as well as for your filing that you'll have to do to get the ends nice and neat. Alright, so I'm going to cut 2 pieces of the 8 gauge half round that length. Start with that part. Alright, let's just cut this off. That one a little long. Okay, I'm going to flatten these out, and I'm going to try and get them to be just exactly the same length, because I probably cut them close but not exact. I also want to get the ends all nice and filed neat. I have a plan on how to reproduce this ring. I think I did it a hard way before, but I think I might know an easier way to do it. We'll see if it works. It'll be a fun experiment. Unless it fails, and then it'll be a bummer. But you never come away from something like that without learning a little bit about something. So, alright, that's pretty close. Just going to file these ends nice and flat. Now, those are going to be the 2 outside bands here. We're going to make this inner piece, but we got to figure out how long to make it. So, I'm going to have to guess a little bit on this one. I'll tell you what we can do is we can make it significantly longer, and then we can cut it down to the size that it needs to be when we're going to solder it all together. So let's try it that way. I want it to stick out some to either side. I'm going to just give myself plenty of room here. It's about 1/4 of an inch on either side. And then I'll cut them that long. Find that 14 gauge round. Where'd you go? Oh, there you go. I was a little nervous when I'm doing something that I haven't tried for a long time. So my skills are a lot better now than they were back then as far as soldering and stuff. But if I don't remember exactly how I did something, sometimes I have to improvise. Okay, now I'm going to spend a little time getting these all straight so I can solder them together. I use the wide nose pliers usually just to hold the wire, and then I use my fingers to straighten things. That usually seems to, for me, that works best. That's not straight yet. I can tell because it doesn't roll very well. So once I get these other 2 a little closer to straight, then I can kind of see which one rolls the best. That's how I usually check to see if round wire is straight. Sometimes just laying it on the table you can see where the curve is then. Probably said this in another video. It's funny, when I was teaching high schoolers how to do this kind of stuff, you'd tell them, okay, you need to straighten that piece of wire. And, you know, like 2 minutes later, they'd come back and show it to you and say, Chad, is that good enough? Like, no. I used to award them the title of wire mangler. I actually gave out a certificate to somebody once. On my channel, you'll notice I sorted everything into some different playlists as well as the ones that were existing up previously. I tried to categorize things as beginner, intermediate, or advanced. And it's kind of arbitrary on my part. But maybe it'll help people choose projects that might be within their skill range at the time. Or ones, if you want to push your skills a little and try and learn something new, you could do one that's, you know, the next step above what you consider yourself. It's all kind of relative. Years ago, back in the days of news groups, if any of you are old enough to remember that, they were like bulletin boards where you could post on particular topics. And I was first starting to teach classes, and I was describing the classes that I was offering, and somebody came at me pretty hard saying, that's not advanced. And what I meant was, it's advanced compared to, you know, someone who just learned. I was kind of doing relative categories. But boy, the trolls were there even back then. So I'm sure he felt very important about his putting me in my place. Recently, though, with my interactions online, I've had very nice people. You guys, for instance. Okay, I think that's probably straight enough. Let's see if I can find sort of a flattish spot somewhere here. I have to invest in some new pads here pretty soon. As of the taping of this video, I'm approaching 1,400 subscribers. It's amazing. I can't believe that we got that many. Thanks, those of you who subscribe. Thanks in advance, those of you who might subscribe. Okay, so I'm going to use quite a bit of solder on this, because I want a good seam all the way up and down it. Nobody always worries about how they place their solder on stuff like this, but quite honestly, when you have a seam like this where they're touching pretty much up and down the whole length, or even, you know, really close to touching, solder acts, when it turns into a liquid, just like a lot of liquids, is that it has a tendency to wick along seams, and so it should run up and down that whole seam. You know, as long as everything's fluxed and stays together nice. Let's see if I'm telling you the truth or not. Let's put some solder on here. If you ever have your solder sticking to your tweezers, sometimes you get a little flux on your tweezers, and it just needs to clean them off a bit so things don't stick anymore. All right. Trick to doing this well is heating the entire piece. If you point it along the length like this, it goes faster too. If you point it this way, all the excess heat's bleeding off over there. So that's a speed trick if you want to increase how fast things happen. Usually keep pick in my hand if I need to kind of drag some solder somewhere. Usually you don't. We've got a little spread down here going on. You watch though, when that wicks up along there, it'll pull it together. Get solder, don't make a liar of me. See how I pulled it together? I'm going to add just a little tiny bit down here. Oops. It looked like a lot of it went into that one side, so I'm going to add a little bit in this side that's towards me. Get everything hot again, make sure it kind of works its way down. But isn't that neat how it just kind of wicks right along the whole seam? I always thought that was cool. Okay, looks like we got a pretty good seam there. I think this is my plan here. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but we'll find out. If you look at the bottom of this, this is soldered in between these two. So I think and this is supposed to stick out a little further than the other ones, so let's make sure we've got plenty of room there. But I need to bend these ones, the outside ones, into little chevron shapes a bit, so I need to find the center. One way to see how close they are is just to flip this around, see if it still lines up when the ends are lined up. So we're pretty close. Good enough, I think. Right? If they're way off, they'll be separated then like that. So that's one way to check to see if you found the center. Okay, so a couple of things you can do here. You can take this to the edge of something sharp like the edge of a table and just push it down slightly. So you could just go like this. And just get a slight little bend like that. See, I didn't even get it quite in the center. The other thing you could do would be just to take your flat nose pliers and put the end of it right where the mark is that I made. Keep it flat on the table and just bend it slightly like that. So close enough for what we're doing, I think, here. So what we'll do then, I need to find the center of this, or pretty close. Then I think we'll solder these together like this. Okay. So let's see if we can't solder these guys together. Alright. I think I'm just going to pick solder these probably. Getting to have quite a bit of metal here, so turn up the torch a bit. Okay, so I think our next step is going to be, I'm going to curve all of this part of the way, and then I'm going to make these ones into the shape they're going to be eventually, which is completely around. And then I'll be able to tell then when we have it at the right size how much of that I need to leave on to connect to this. It'll make more sense, I think, probably as we go along here. Okay. So I'm going to start down here. We're going to do some bending around the mandrel like that. Okay. So what that does then, at least in my plan here, it allows me to bend these two towards each other and these two towards each other. I'll solder those ones closed, and then I should be able to round those ones out without these affecting much. And then after that, I'll be able to position the bezel and file things down to where they need to be in order to mount it, you know, kind of like that. But I got to turn these into complete bands first, the two outside ones. So I'm going to have to use a third hand for this one. Where did I put you? I think the best way to do this would be maybe just to set it up like that. I guess we'll find out. I'm always thinking about what's going to fall off if I position it in this particular way. But I think if I heat it right, I should be able to just get those to flow, and then I can round them out, and then we can start with the rest of it. I could curve a couple of pieces and drape them over that. That's another option that you can do. These other little wires are kind of sticking up exposed, so I need to keep that in mind when I'm heating this. It's easy to be focused on one part of your piece, and while you're trying to heat the right spot, you're melting something else. You know, so it happens. At least it happens to me once in a while. Oops. So what happened there was I didn't get this side of the band hot enough on this side over here, but this side got hot enough, so it jumped the gap over there. That was my bad. Let's clean up the inside of these two bands that I just did. Make sure there's no excess solder. Okay, so in theory, should be able to round these out. I just need to be careful how I aim this. So I try to get them level with the Dremel a little bit to make it a little easier to do, but there's a couple of things to think about this. This is where the solder joint is on the rings that I just made, so chances are there's enough solder in there to solder this down when I go to do that. Just in case there's not, I'm going to sweat a little bit on the back of this in a couple of spots. That way I won't have to probably go back and redo anything. We'll try that and see how close we are. Getting things centered is one of my challenges. So most of the mass is in the band here, so I'm going to heat down below. And then towards the end, when I think everything's getting pretty hot, then I'm going to heat from above. It has to do with something that's more massive. It takes a lot longer to get up to the temperature you need it to than the little thing on top here. So the trick is figuring out how close you are to soldering temperature. So I saw a seam forming around there, so I think we're okay. Okay, so that looks like it's down reasonably straight. So now I have to figure out how much of these to cut off in order to get them to meet at the side there, and that's going to be sort of challenging. So I'm going to have to make some estimates. Like, I know it's not going to be longer than it is as tall as this bezel, so I'm going to cut it off to start with there. Match on both sides. Hey, look at that. Caught on film, I broke some wire cutters. Well, I probably got 15 years out of those before they broke. This is just a particularly hard piece of silver. Okay, so now I have to do a little manual bending here to see where we're at. Unless you wanted to do some kind of funky ring like that, that might be kind of cool. Doesn't look like it would be very comfortable, probably. So I'm going to start filing it. I need to file it at an angle like this so that it meets up nice on the bottom of the side of the bezel there. And I'll also have to cut this one a little closer too. So it's pretty close. I'm going to have to, I got a slight curve on the side of the bezel, so I'm going to use the Dremel to round that out a bit too. And do a little bit of fiddling, trying to get this to be up against the side here. That's the tricky part. I'm going to go ahead and try and solder this on to the sides now. And again, keeping in mind where all the mass is at. I'm going to decide where to heat it. So, looks like we got both sides without any further problems, hopefully. I can file the top of that bezel down after I pickle it, and then we'll set the stone and polish it. So, hang loose for a bit, pickle for a while. Pickle time. So I did a little bit of cleanup with the Dremel, and make sure we're pointed in the right direction here. I cut a couple of pieces of tag board and put them underneath and did some filing down on the bezel so it's not so tall. And now we'll go ahead and set this, and then I'll polish it, and we'll take a look at the final product. With setting with a pair of pliers, you just use the flat side here, push it straight in at first, and then you start rolling it over, like laying it over like that, with quite a bit of pressure. Once you have it laid down pretty good, then you can just burnish with this outer smooth portion. That's where you just put a lot of pressure on that top edge there and rub it smooth. See how that looks. Alright, now I'll go take it to the polishing machine and we'll see how it comes out. That's the finished product. It came out looking pretty good. I'm pleased with the black onyx. That looks really stunning against the silver. So it's almost hard to make something not pretty with black onyx, I think, with silver. So, all right. So that's how you make one of those. Okay, well that was the bezel set cabochon with an offset band, and I hope you enjoyed that. Make sure to hit the like button before you leave, and I'd love to have you subscribe. Again, there's a couple of ways to support me if you're interested, the Patreon or the Buy Me a Coffee links that are both in the project description down below. So check those out, see what I have to offer there, and maybe sign up. I also have a website too, and I'll put a link up here for it, up there I think is where it goes. If you want to visit that and see some of the stuff that I've made and make and that's for sale, you can check that out too. So right up there. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you coming. Happy silversmithing. Take care.